Welcome to the second of the 4 lectures on international trade. So in the first lecture and its extension video, we checked out the history of thought on international trade. In this segment, we will discuss free trade, which is the established mainstream view in our day. Free trade is a term that we hear quite a bit in today's world, both in economic and non-economic contexts. It simply refers to an international trade regime with minimal or no trade restrictions or barriers. So you can think of it as unmanaged foreign trade. So two companies in two different countries are trading products with one another. Their governments are not involved in this transaction. So from our earlier example, Harley-Davidson is selling its products to, let's say, Germany, and German Mercedes company or Daimler-Benz is selling its cars in the U.S., where the U.S. and German governments are not involving in this transaction by imposing any kind of restrictions or barriers. This approach would be called free trade. Now, this concept is close to another concept that we hear quite a bit, free markets or free market economics. But please understand that free trade is used in economics as a term that explains international economic relations, whereas free markets are purely about domestic economic transactions. They both rely on the same philosophy of minimum government intervention in the economy, but free markets is more of a domestic economy term. Free trade is an international economy term. So we said free trade restrictions or barriers. When they're removed, we're looking at a free trade regime. So what are those trade restrictions or barriers? There are 5 main instruments used to date. First and foremost is tariffs. Then you have quotas, regulations, currency devaluation, and subsidies. In the next few slides, we will discuss these 5 trade restrictions. Tariffs are simply another term for import taxes. So if German BMW is selling its cars in the US, then the US company is, US government is applying a particular import tax on German cars that other US companies like Ford or GM are not paying, then this would be an import tax or tariff. Like every other idea in economics, there are pros and cons attached to this instrument. Some of the advantages are that, first and foremost, it provides tax revenues for the government, for the US government, especially if you think about how large the trade volume is into the US, then you would realize there's a large sum of money coming to the US Treasury every year as a result of tariffs. And secondly, it's a trade protection instruments, which means that it supports domestic companies, the US companies, against foreign competition. Because if, let's say, BMW is competing with, Lincoln maybe, a US-made luxury car manufacturer, but BMW has to pay a certain additional tax that Lincoln doesn't, then BMWs would be sold more expensive than Lincolns, and as a result, Lincoln would have an advantage against foreign competition. This is called protectionism, and it's the underlying logic behind all these trade restrictions that we're discussing. But having said that, tariffs have some major drawbacks as well. First and foremost, it attracts retaliation by the other government. So when the US government says that there is now a tariff, or we're increasing tariffs on let's say, German cars, let's go by the same example throughout the lecture to make it easier to understand. Then what will happen is just the German government will respond and retaliate, and they will increase tariffs on something else that comes, some other product that comes from the US. So in net effect, you actually don't benefit much from it. We see this type of economic war between China and US today. As you know, US leadership likes to apply tariffs on Chinese goods in order to curb their sales and consumption inside the US and give US companies some chances. But China, it takes just hours, not even days, for Chinese government to respond with some sort of retaliation. So net effect will be zero. And the second drawback of tariffs is that it also may lead to inflation, or at least more small-scale price increases in certain industries. So what happens here is that when one product has higher tariffs for imported goods, then those goods prices would rise in the market shelves, and the domestic manufacturers of the same item could respond by increasing their prices a little bit, but still below the import prices in order to remain competitive. But as a result, from consumers' viewpoint, that's a bad thing, because when they look at the shelves, they see prices rose for every manufacturer that sells that one particular item. Quotas is the second trade restriction instrument, and it simply means volume restrictions on imports. So hypothetically, this is the US government telling that, for example, to, let's say, Toyota, that no more than, 500,000 Toyotas would be sold in the US per year, something like this. There's some sort of an upper cap as to how many units can be sold and brought to the US every year. This is quota. Third instrument is regulations. This is simply changing the rules that the foreign companies that sell their products in the US would have to abide by. And this is actually considered to be quite a clever type of and functional type of trade restriction, because one, it's not as obvious, as let's say tariffs. Tariffs are very clear what products you apply the rate, whereas regulations, you're not directly targeting any particular country or company. You're just saying that, for these products to be sold in the US, then now this is the new rule. But you're free to sell and send as many of your product as you can, that as long as they satisfy this particular new condition. If you think about again, if we go by the car example, car industry, then US government, hypothetically, if they come out and say that we now increase the emission standards for cars to be sold in the US, meaning, car exhaust cannot emit any more than a particular level of pollutants to air, from now on, then this would directly eliminate the number of companies whose products don't satisfy this condition. This is a very clever, if not just downright insidious form of trade restriction. And one advantage of this is that the regulations creates a positive good for the society. In our car example, if all cars have to go by higher emission standards, this means there's less pollution, air pollution now, so we all benefit from it. And also, because it's so subtle, then it just doesn't attract retaliation from any other country. But the negative side of it is that it can also hurt some domestic producers too. So if the US says this much emission is a new minimum, or new maximum, then maybe Ford and GM and other US companies may not be able to reach that level and not sell their products either. So that could be a drawback. Currency manipulation is a more recently done type of instrument for trade restrictions. And here what happens is one government simply keeps its national currency's exchange value artificially low in order to boost its company's exports. and reduce the economy's imports. Because lower the exchange value of a currency, more or cheaper that country's products would be for outside of that country, therefore boosting the exports of that country, and vice versa. Foreign products would be more expensive in that country, so therefore the imports would also go down. So imagine that. Actually, we don't have to imagine this is real data. Between 1994 and 2008, Chinese government followed an exchange rate regime called pegging, which means fixating the value of a currency to another currency at a certain rate, right? And Chinese yuan, yuan is the name of one unit of Chinese money. Renminbi is their national currency. Yuan is the name for one unit of it. So Chinese yuan was pegged to the US dollar at the rate of $1 equaling 8.70 yuans. And this went on between 1994 and 2008 for a good 15 years. During this time period, Chinese economy has grown much faster than the U.S. economy, and the inflation rates and etc. were such that if this pegging was not adopted, then Chinese currency would be expected to appreciate in value against the U.S. dollar, which would make Chinese products more expensive for U.S. consumers and U.S. products more cheaper for Chinese consumers, boosting U.S. exports to China and reducing U.S. imports from China, or in other words, trade surplus would increase with China from U.S.'s perspective, but it did not happen. They pegged the currency at that rate, which is artificially, they manipulated the currency, and which functioned as a trade barrier. And lastly, subsidies. Subsidies are any kind of a government assistance given to domestic companies. Typically, it takes the form of either providing actual cash money to U.S. companies for whatever reason, or providing tax breaks of various sorts. In the U.S. Today, there's a much discussion on this notion. Subsidies have generally been a thing of the past. It's not a commonly used instrument anymore, but there are some cases that some companies, and especially those that deserve these type of subsidies least, meaning they are in the financially best situation possible, as they are the market leaders in emerging markets, growing markets, they do get assistance like this from the U.S. government. The total amount of handouts to corporations like Boeing, Shell, GM, Ford, Amazon, and Nike was around $100 billion a year last several years. And this concept is so absurd that a term was created for this. We now call this corporate welfare, and which is criticized as socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. In this slide here, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert Reich and the economics professor at UC Berkeley explains this corporate welfare notion quite dramatically, and so please make sure to check out this video.